a United States Special Operations officer, sat across a table at Long Bin in the summer of 1967, a briefing document spread flat in front of him, outlining how the Australian SAS squadron recently arrived in Phuoc Toi Province would be integrated into American long-range reconnaissance patrol coordination. He had expected a formality, a handshake, a bit of professional courtesy between allies. What he got instead was something he had absolutely no framework to process. The Australian SAS officer on the other side of the table listened to the entire briefing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push back. He sat, perfectly still, with the kind of patience that only comes from years of waiting motionless in jungle undergrowth. And when the American finished, the Australian folded his copy of the briefing document, placed it back on the table, looked the American officer directly in the eye, and said something that would be repeated in increasingly frustrated American classified cables for years afterward. Something that no Allied officer was supposed to say to a liaison representative of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. He told him, with absolute calm, that the Australian SAS didn't come to Vietnam to follow American orders. They came to fight, and they would fight their own way. Wait, what? An Australian SAS officer from a nation contributing fewer than 8,000 soldiers to a war consuming hundreds of thousands of Americans just sat across from a Military Assistance Command Vietnam representative and rejected the entire coordination framework being offered to him? A framework backed by the full authority of General William Westmoreland himself. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what that Australian SAS officer was protecting wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't arrogance. It was a method, a specific, tested, combat-proven methodology developed through years of jungle warfare in Borneo and Malaya that American Special Operations doctrine had never encountered and could not replicate. And when the results started coming in from Phuoc Toi Province, patrol after patrol, ambush after ambush, intelligence report after intelligence report, the Americans would find themselves staring at statistics that made no sense by any metric they had been trained to understand. Nearly 1,200 patrols. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, including 492 killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded, and the Viet Cong, the men who had been fighting in these jungles their entire lives, would eventually give the Australians a name that had no equivalent in any other Allied force's reputation. They called them Ma Rung. Members of the regiment were known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. Stay with me, because what these men did in the jungles of Phuoc Toi Province, how they did it, and why American commanders couldn't stop them from doing it their own way, is one of the most extraordinary and least understood stories of the entire Vietnam War. To understand why the Australian SAS refused American operational direction, you need to go back before Vietnam entirely. You need to go back to a jungle that wasn't in Southeast Asia at all. You need to go back to Borneo. The Indonesian confrontation, running from 1963 to 1966, was a low-intensity but genuinely lethal conflict in which Indonesian military forces attempted to destabilize the newly formed Federation of Malaysia by infiltrating across the border into Sarawak and Sabah. The British, Malaysians, New Zealanders, and, Australians responded with a counterinsurgency campaign that became, in the judgment of military historians who examined it afterward, one of the most technically proficient jungle warfare operations of the 20th century. The Australian SAS deployed to Borneo under the framework of British SAS doctrine and Commonwealth counterinsurgency methodology. The regiment first saw active service in Borneo in 1965 and 1966 during the Indonesian confrontation, mainly conducting reconnaissance patrols, including secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory. Those cross-border operations, known as Operation Claret, were so sensitive they were officially denied for decades. But the men who conducted them came home with something no classroom could teach. They had learned what it felt like to operate completely alone, completely unsupported, in dense jungle for extended periods. They had learned patience at a level that became almost physiological. These extended stays were on average 3 months in duration, so their jungle combat and survival skills became impeccable. This knowledge and experience stood the operators of SASR in good stead for their next deployment, which was to be Vietnam in June 1966. The preparation for Vietnam was itself a signal of how differently the Australians approached the problem. Pre-deployment training for Vietnam was conducted in Papua New Guinea with the aim to hone jungle skills, acclimatize to a tropical environment, but more so for each patrol member to bond. Operators had to become acutely familiar with one another's skills and idiosyncrasies to the point where they almost knew what each member was thinking. That last detail matters more than it might seem. American Special Operations units of the Vietnam era were built around individual rotation systems. Soldiers and officers cycled through units on individual timelines, which meant the team you fought with this month might be entirely different from the team you fought with 3 months ago. The Australians deployed as formed units, rotated together, and trained together for months before a single boot touched Vietnamese soil. The psychological cohesion this produced was not a small advantage. In a 5-man patrol operating behind enemy lines without radio contact for days at a time, the difference between a team that trusts each other instinctively and a team that is still learning each other's habits is the difference between coming home and not coming home. 3 Squadron was the first squadron to be deployed to Vietnam. Flying to Vietnam from the SAS regimental base in Perth, 3 Squadron arrived at Vung Tau via Saigon on the 16th of June 1966 and moved to Nui Dat the next day. The base at Nui Dat was still being established. Rubber plantation trees stood in deliberate rows around the perimeter. The red laterite earth had been scraped and leveled by engineers who were still working when the SAS troopers arrived. Within days of arrival, before the base had even been fully secured, the Australians were out in the jungle. From the 20th to the 22nd of June, each troop conducted a 24-hour patrol of the area immediately around the base at Nui Dat. The first enemy contact occurred on 25th of June when 3 Squadron was fired on by a group of Viet Cong. 9 days on the ground. That was all it took before the Viet Cong found them. Except the Viet Cong didn't find them. They found their patrol route and tried to ambush it. That is not the same thing. The distinction would define the entire Australian SAS experience in Vietnam. By the end of June, as Nui Dat developed and the Australian infantry began patrolling the area around the base, the SAS began patrolling further afield. 3 Squadron's first long-range patrol was to the Nui Din Hills, 7 kilometers west of Nui Dat. 7 kilometers doesn't sound like much on a map. In triple canopy Vietnamese jungle, moving at Australian SAS pace, silent, deliberate, every footfall placed with conscious care. 7 kilometers might take the better part of a day. And that was exactly the point. Speed was the enemy of information. Speed created noise. Speed meant disturbed undergrowth, bent grass, the kind of trail disturbance that Viet Cong scouts could read like a newspaper. The Australians moved slowly because moving slowly was the only way to arrive anywhere without the enemy already knowing you were coming. Small fire teams of 4 to 6 men moved much more slowly than any other unit, even other special operations units. But once in contact with the enemy, the Australians unleashed a barrage of fire, designed to make the enemy believe there were more men on the opposing side than there really were. The slow, quiet movement and hellish raking fire the Australians brought to the NVA and VC made them the most feared enemy unit in the areas of South Vietnam. That paradox, near absolute silence followed by absolute violence, was the tactical signature of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. It was the product of a specific doctrinal philosophy that had no equivalent in American special operations. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRRPs, operated on a framework that prioritized communication and extraction. Get in, gather information, get out, and get help if anything went wrong. The philosophy was essentially risk management. Keep the team safe, keep the communication lines open, extract before a bad situation becomes catastrophic. This was rational, well-designed doctrine for a system built on individual rotations where units changed frequently and institutional memory was thin. The Australian doctrine was built on a fundamentally different assumption. It assumed the patrol was sufficient. 5 men, inserted deep, moving silently, with the skill and training to handle whatever they encountered. These patrols were small, normally only 5 men, and were usually inserted into an area by helicopter. The patrol would then either set an ambush or concentrate on gathering information. This information included locating VC bases, monitoring their movements, and reporting on enemy numbers. The insertion by helicopter was itself an art form. The Australians worked closely with No. 9 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, whose Iroquois pilots became experts at delivering 5-man teams into the exact jungle landing zone required, regularly providing rapid and precise insertion and extraction of patrols into jungle landing zones at treetop height. But the helicopter was just the delivery mechanism. What the patrol did after landing was where the Australian method diverged so completely from American practice that observers from MACV who watched early operations came away with reports that described what they'd seen as almost incomprehensible. The Australians disappeared. Not metaphorically, literally. They entered the jungle and became part of it, and for days or weeks, the only confirmation they were still alive was a brief, scheduled radio transmission at a time of their choosing. On occasion, SASR patrols were also deployed by M113 armored personnel carriers, with a method devised to deceive the Viet Cong as to their insertion and the location of their drop-off point, despite the noise they made moving through the jungle. This kind of tactical creativity, using armored personnel carriers not for firepower, but as a deception tool to mask the actual patrol insertion, illustrated the way Australian SAS thinking operated at every level. Every element of an operation was considered for its deception value, its concealment value, its psychological value on the enemy. An American unit used resources to accomplish a mission directly. An Australian SAS patrol used resources to make the enemy wrong about where you were, what you were doing, and how many of you there were. The friction with American command structures began almost immediately, though it took time to fully crystallize. The first Australian task force had been granted its own tactical area of responsibility in Phuoc Thai province through negotiations conducted at the highest levels of both armies. Negotiations between senior Australian and U.S. commanders, including Lieutenant General John Wilton and General William Westmoreland, ensured one ATF would be an independent command under the operational control of U.S. 2 Field Force Vietnam, a Corps-level headquarters in Bien Hoa, which reported directly to Commander USMACV. One RAR's attachment to U.S. forces had highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods, and Australian and U.S. military leaders subsequently agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province. That would allow the Australian Army to fight their own tactical war independently of the U.S. That phrase, fight their own tactical war, is the key to understanding everything that followed. The Australians hadn't wandered into independence by accident. They had negotiated it deliberately at the highest levels before a single battalion had been committed. The experience of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment attached to the American 173rd Airborne Brigade in 1965 had provided all the evidence Australian military leadership needed that integration into American units and American doctrine would produce neither Australian tactical results nor Australian appropriate casualty rates. One RAR's attachment to U.S. forces had highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods. Whereas the Americans relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, the Australians, although not eschewing conventional operations, emphasized deliberate patrolling using dispersed companies supported by artillery, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages, while slowly extending government control. The SAS, as the intelligence and deep reconnaissance arm of the Australian Task Force, embodied this philosophical separation most completely. The SAS was based at Nui Dat, where it acted as the eyes and the ears of the 1st Australian Task Force and operated throughout Phuoc Toi province, as well as in Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Thuy provinces. SAS personnel were highly trained, and their role in Vietnam varied from conducting reconnaissance patrols and observing enemy movement to offensive operations deep in enemy territory. When American liaison officers arrived to discuss coordination, they expected to find something analogous to their own LRRP units, just wearing different uniforms. They found something that had almost no operational similarity beyond the basic fact of small teams in hostile terrain. The specific flashpoints of Australian SAS defiance toward American coordination requests are documented in the historical record in ways that are not always dramatic in their surface presentation, but are extraordinary in their institutional implications. American intelligence officers at MACV periodically requested that Australian SAS patrols modify their communication schedules, transmitting more frequently, providing real-time location updates, conforming to the reporting architecture that American intelligence systems were built to receive. The Australian response, consistent and politely immovable across 5 years of the deployment, was that their communication protocols were operationally determined by the patrol commander in the field, and that no external authority would dictate those protocols. The role of the SAS in Vietnam started similar to that of their deployment to Borneo, which was intelligence gathering and deep reconnaissance. But this quickly morphed into a more offensive style of operations, and ambushing became the bread and butter of the regiment. The Americans wanted the Australians to conform to LRRP doctrine: get in fast, call in regularly, extract when in contact. The Australians had a different framework entirely. Operator numbers were usually up around 120, and this was with New Zealand SAS attachments. This gave the squadron 24 5-man patrols. Patrols per year numbered between 230 and 245 in areas such as Phuoc Tuy, Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Thuy provinces. What those numbers represent is a continuous, overlapping intelligence picture of the entire province, not a snapshot, not a 3-day reconnaissance, a living, constantly updated map of enemy movement, behavior, and pattern built through dozens of simultaneous patrols, each one adding to the institutional knowledge the Australian task force was accumulating about how the Viet Cong operated in this specific terrain. The doctrine of patient observation before offensive action was perhaps the sharpest point of American frustration. American special operations culture valued speed to contact. Find the enemy, fix the enemy, destroy the enemy with superior firepower. The Australians valued something else entirely. Pre-deployment training had been designed so that patrol members bonded to the point where they almost knew what each member was thinking. This was the psychological foundation of a method that could only work if every member of a patrol was operating from a shared mental framework, wordlessly, in silence, in the dark, in terrain that punished every error. That shared framework was what allowed an Australian SAS patrol to maintain observation positions within direct view of Viet Cong activity for extended periods without compromising their position. To watch enemy forces move, count, record, and wait, not because they couldn't fight, but because fighting before the intelligence picture was complete was doctrinally premature, and premature fights got people killed. The body count controversy is where the institutional friction became most visible and most acute. General William Westmoreland's MACV had established body count as the primary metric of military effectiveness throughout the American commitment in Vietnam. The logic was industrial. Attrit the enemy faster than he could replace himself, and eventually the enemy would run out of soldiers. General William Westmoreland is reported to have complained to Major General Tim Vincent that 1 ATF was not being aggressive enough. By comparison, U.S. forces sought to flush out the enemy and achieve rapid and decisive victory through brazen scrub bashing and the use of massive firepower. And specifically regarding the SAS and the broader Australian force, the U.S. measure of success, the body count, was apparently held in contempt by many 1 ATF battalion commanders. This was not a small cultural disagreement. This was a direct, documented, institutional clash between two different conceptions of what winning a counterinsurgency looks like. The Americans had built their entire reporting and reward structure around the accumulation of enemy dead. Units earned prizes, decorations, and vacation if they presented high body counts. High body counts did not begin with the Vietnam War. However, it became most identified with that war and offered an index of success. The Australians had built their entire operational structure around the accumulation of enemy intelligence. The SAS, most specifically, had built their structure around understanding how the enemy moved, where they resupplied, who their commanders were, and how to position forces to exploit that knowledge over time. Body count was a byproduct of successful Australian SAS operations, not the objective. And when American liaison officers insisted that the Australians needed to increase their contact rates, their reported kills, their contribution to the overall statistical picture of the war, the Australian SAS effectively told them that wasn't why they were there. Historian Albert Palazzo comments that when the Australians entered the Vietnam War, it was with their own well-considered concept of war, and this was often contradictory or in conflict with U.S. concepts. The 1 ATF light infantry tactics such as patrolling, searching villages without destroying them, and ambush and counter-ambush drew criticism from some U.S. commanders. The SAS embodied this doctrinal divergence at its most extreme, because the SAS operated at the furthest point from American oversight. Out in the jungle on a patrol that had been on the ground for 10 days, there was no American officer to argue with. There was no American liaison to consult. There was a 5-man Australian patrol making operational decisions based on training and doctrine that had been built over a decade of Commonwealth jungle warfare experience, and those decisions looked nothing like American doctrine. Major Reginald Beasley, commanding 3 Squadron on its second tour, made the point explicitly when he physically knocked down the kills boards that previous squadrons had erected in the squadron lines, the boards where patrol kills were tallied and displayed. "We were not there to kill people, but to gain information," he later said. In a war where American units were competing to produce body count statistics, an Australian SAS squadron commander was literally tearing down the scoreboards. The defiance was not rhetorical, it was physical and institutional. The practical difference between Australian SAS doctrine and American LRRP doctrine showed most clearly in the way patrols handled the moment of contact with the enemy. American LRRPs were trained to break contact and extract. 5 men against an unknown-size enemy force in hostile territory was not a situation American doctrine considered winnable. Break contact, call in support, extract, report. The Australian SAS had a different relationship with the mathematics of contact. Writing of SAS patrol contacts, Captain A.W. Fremantle observed, "When contact is initiated by the enemy, the immediate retaliation with a heavy volume of automatic fire, even if only in the general direction of the enemy, serves not only to keep his head down, but to create an illusion of a far larger force." Operating in small groups of 4 to 6 men, they moved more slowly than conventional infantry through jungle or bushland, and were heavily armed, employing a high rate of fire to simulate a larger force on contact and to support their withdrawal. This was not bravado. It was calculated. A Viet Cong patrol that found itself suddenly receiving what sounded and felt like fire from a large force would hesitate, would take cover, would spend critical seconds trying to assess the size of what they had encountered. Those seconds were the margin the Australian SAS used to break contact and disappear back into jungle they had been studying for days. The enemy would search the area they had just fired into and find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no trails they could follow. Just jungle. It was this specific quality, the ability to be present, to strike, and to vanish completely, that produced the reputation the Viet Cong codified as Ma Rung. During their time in Vietnam, SAS patrols had such an impact on the VC that it was reported that a bounty, dead or alive, of $5,000 was placed on the head of each Ma Rung, Phantom of the Jungle. $5,000 American dollars was an extraordinary sum in the Vietnamese economy of the late 1960s. It represented years of civilian income. The Viet Cong command structure was not in the business of paying bounties for units it was not genuinely afraid of. The fact that the bounty existed at all, that it had been authorized and circulated through Viet Cong communication channels as an actual operational directive, tells you more about the effectiveness of Australian SAS operations than any statistic in any American after-action report. The enemy was trying to buy a solution to a problem they could not solve tactically, because they couldn't find the Australians, because the Australians didn't fight the way the enemy expected anyone to fight. The bounty also reflected something the Australian method had achieved that American doctrine specifically tried to produce but rarely did: psychological dominance. Not the psychological dominance of overwhelming firepower, which the Americans possessed in quantities the Viet Cong could never match. Something subtler and in some ways more durable: the psychological dominance of uncertainty. A Viet Cong unit operating in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1968 or 1969 could not know whether it was being watched. It could not know whether that 5-man patrol it had identified and lost track of yesterday was 1 kilometer away or 10 meters away. It could not operate according to its own planning cycle because the Australian SAS had introduced an irreducible variable into every calculation. The enemy's operational tempo slowed. Their confidence in the security of their own territory eroded. They made mistakes that intelligence gathered, patient, precise Australian operations were designed to exploit. By the time of one squadron's second tour, VC activity in the province was decreasing, and the squadron faced the frustrating prospect of operations limited to reconnaissance tasks around Nui Dat. Some patrols went months without enemy contact or sightings. The Viet Cong weren't gone. They were avoiding territory where Australian SAS patrols operated. That is the clearest possible evidence of tactical success in counterinsurgency. Not that you killed the enemy in great numbers, but that you made him afraid to move in his own backyard. American commanders watching this process from outside found it almost maddening. The metrics they had were built to measure an active, contact-heavy war. Patrols that produced no contact, produced no data points the American system could recognize as success. When General Westmoreland complained to Major General Tim Vincent that the Australians were not being aggressive enough, he was expressing not a personal opinion, but an institutional category error. He was applying the diagnostic tools of a war of attrition to a force conducting population-centric counterinsurgency, and the tools simply didn't fit the job. The arrangement allowed the force greater freedom of action and the chance to demonstrate the Australian Army's evolving concept for counterinsurgency warfare, developed in part from its operations. During the Malayan emergency, the Australians were demonstrating something. The Americans largely couldn't read the demonstration because they were looking at it with the wrong instruments. The Australian SAS also influenced American Special Operations methodology directly, even as they maintained their doctrinal independence. Australian SASR personnel also worked with U.S. Army Special Forces in Vietnam and provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School and then to the LRRP Training Wing at the AATTV-operated Van Keep Training Center from 1967. Australian SASR personnel also worked with U.S. Army Special Forces in Vietnam and provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School. There is a profound institutional irony in this arrangement. The same force whose operational independence made American commanders furious, whose refusal to adopt American communication protocols and contact doctrines generated years of classified friction, that same force was simultaneously being asked to teach American LRRP personnel how to operate more effectively in jungle terrain. The Americans recognized the Australian SAS was better at this specific work. They wanted to learn from them. They just couldn't bring themselves to leave them alone, to do it their own way while they were doing it. Many patrols included U.S. long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from the 101st Airborne Division. In September, the squadron participated in Operation Santa Fe, a joint operation conducted by Australian, American, and South Vietnamese troops, focusing on the VC stronghold in the Nui Mai Tao Mountains. The Mai Tao Mountains, in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy Province, were the deepest redoubt of the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, the main Viet Cong force operating in the province. The VC were located in a vast tract of jungle which could not be isolated outside the artillery and mortar range of the Australians at Nui Dat. This terrain, beyond the range of direct support, requiring patrols to operate in a genuinely self-sufficient manner, was exactly where the Australian SAS method proved most decisive, because their method didn't depend on fire support being immediately available. It depended on intelligence, patience, and the willingness to operate in the deep jungle without a safety net. Most time was spent patrolling around the Mai Tao Mountains. These and the other mountains in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy were enemy strongholds. The SAS patrols that mapped the Mai Tao area, that traced the supply routes and identified the trail networks, that accumulated the intelligence picture that eventually allowed major operations against the area. Those patrols produced results that no American-style sweep of the same terrain would have produced, because an American sweep would have been heard coming for 20 kilometers, and by the time it arrived, the jungle would have been empty. The success of December operations was a direct result of information gathered from SAS patrols. During this tour, emphasis was on the SAS's reconnaissance role rather than ambushing or other tasks. That direct credit, intelligence gathered by SAS patrols, enabling a successful operation by conventional infantry forces, was the Australian model working exactly as designed. The SAS was not the main effort. The SAS was what made the main effort possible. It was intelligence infrastructure on legs, operating for weeks in conditions that conventional infantry couldn't sustain, accumulating knowledge that transformed the tactical picture. When American observers looked at Australian SAS operations and saw low body counts and minimal dramatic action, they were looking at the preparatory phase of a methodology that produced results downstream. They were judging the foundation and ignoring the building. The relationship between Australian SAS and American Special Operations was never simply adversarial. There were genuine moments of mutual respect and professional recognition. When Americans who had operated alongside Australian SAS patrols, the men from the 101st Airborne's LRRP units who conducted joint patrols, the Special Forces advisors who worked in the same operational areas, were asked about their experiences, the accounts were consistent. The Australians moved in a way that made experienced American operators feel they were learning something new. The silence, specifically, was unsettling even to people who understood what it meant and why it was being maintained. An Australian liaison officer recalled, "I don't think they're as well trained as we were, but they were very brave men. They tended to move through the jungle or stomp through the jungle. They didn't seem to have the same tactical care that we had. we would move somewhat more carefully. They would have a lot of firepower. This first-hand comparison, American bravery acknowledged, American tactical subtlety questioned, came from an Australian who had served alongside American units and could speak from direct observation. It wasn't contempt. It was a professional recognition that the two forces had been built for different things. The Americans had been built for a massive industrial war where firepower was the decisive instrument. The Australians had been built for a war where finding the enemy before he found you was the decisive act, and everything else followed from that. The 6 years of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam produced a statistical record that remains striking even measured by the narrow metrics Americans preferred. During its time in Vietnam, the SASR proved highly successful, with members of the regiment known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, including 492 killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. 600 men rotating through Vietnam over 5 years, conducting 1,200 patrols, at a cost of 1 man killed in action, 1 died of wounds. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. During the period of its deployment, 580 men served in the SASR in Vietnam. When you look at the ratio of enemy casualties inflicted to friendly casualties sustained, the number has no equivalent in American Special Operations records from the same war. The Americans produced larger numbers because they deployed larger forces and conducted larger operations. But the Australian SAS produced results of the same order of magnitude with a fraction of the manpower, using methods that kept their own people alive at a rate that American planners would have considered impossible. The final act of the Australian SAS Vietnam deployment contained its own quiet statement of independence. After 5 years of SAS patrolling, the VC had finally become familiar with SAS insertion techniques. From June, it was not unusual for the Australians to be fired on shortly after landing in an area. To counter this, the SAS began using cowboy insertions. In a cowboy insertion, the helicopter carrying the patrol was followed by a slick helicopter with a second patrol. Both patrols would be inserted and would travel together for 5 minutes. The second patrol would then stop and wait another 5 minutes while the first patrol continued its mission. If there was no contact with the enemy, the second patrol would then return to the landing zone where it would be extracted. This was not American doctrine. This was not a technique lifted from any MACV training manual. This was the Australian SAS identifying a specific tactical problem. The enemy had learned their insertion signature after 5 years, and inventing a solution from scratch in the field, using Australian resources and Australian thinking. Because that was what they did. That was what they had always done, and nobody was going to tell them to do it any other way. Completing its final tour in October 1971, 2 Squadron was disbanded on return to Australia, with Training Squadron raised in its place. The war that followed their departure, the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, the collapse of everything the Allied forces had spent a decade trying to build, is a separate story with causes far beyond the tactical. But the province, The Australian SAS had spent 5 years patrolling the green interior of Phuoc Toi that had once been described as a Viet Cong stronghold where government authority stopped at the provincial capital's edge, had been measurably transformed by the time the last Australian squadron came home. The transformation wasn't complete, and it didn't hold after the final withdrawal of all Allied forces. But while Australian forces were present, using Australian methods, operating under Australian command, the results were visible in every metric that mattered for counterinsurgency: reduced enemy activity, extended government presence, degraded enemy capability. Results that American doctrine, with 500,000 men and the most powerful military machine in human history, could not consistently produce in its own areas of operations. The legacy of Australian SAS defiance in Vietnam isn't a story about small nations punching above their weight, though that element is real. It isn't a story about the inherent superiority of one national military culture over another, though the comparative results are what they are. It is a story about what happens when a force with a genuinely developed, genuinely tested methodology refuses to abandon that methodology under pressure from a larger and louder ally who hasn't taken the time to understand what they're watching. The Australian SAS came to Vietnam with a method. They came with the Borneo experience in their bodies and the Malayan emergency in their institutional memory, and the specific psychological profile that years of selection and training had produced. Men who could wait in silence for longer than the enemy could believe anyone was waiting, and then strike at a moment of their own choosing. They came with the conviction, verified by every patrol report from the first day to the last, that their method worked, that it worked better than the alternative, that adopting the alternative would cost lives, their own lives, without producing proportionally better results. And when the Americans told them to do it differently, told them to conform, told them that their patrol protocols and their communication schedules and their contact doctrines needed to align with MACV standards, the Australian SAS said, with the unfailing polite firmness of men who have spent a great deal of time being shot at and surviving it, that they had not come to Vietnam to follow American orders. They had come to fight, and they had come to fight their own way. And the Viet Cong who eventually placed a bounty on their heads, a bounty for soldiers they called the phantoms of the jungle, soldiers who could not be found, could not be ambushed, could not be predicted. Those men understood what the Americans with their metrics and their briefing documents never quite grasped. The men who moved through the jungles of Phuoc Toi as if the jungle itself had grown soldiers, the men who could watch you for a week without you knowing they were there, and then kill you precisely, efficiently, and vanish before you could respond. Those men were not operating according to anyone's orders but their own, and that is exactly what made them so extraordinarily dangerous. In the 6 years that the Australian SAS fought in Vietnam, only one operator was killed by enemy fire. He was wounded, but later died in hospital in Australia due to complications. One man in 6 years, nearly 1,200 patrols into enemy-held territory. One man killed by the enemy? The numbers speak what the classified cables never could, and they say it louder than any order anyone ever tried to give them.